Have you ever met someone who only realizes what they had after you stop giving it to them? They didn't mean to push you away, but they did. And when they finally wake up to what they've lost, it's too late to say, I'm sorry. You see, avoidant people don't usually run because they don't care. They run because closeness feels like danger to them. Like getting too close might expose the part of them that fears rejection, judgment, or not being enough. So instead of leaning in, they pull back. Instead of saying, I'm scared, they say, I need space. And instead of asking for reassurance, they convince themselves they don't need anyone at all. But here's what always happens. When the other person finally gives up, when they stop chasing, stop explaining, stop proving their worth, that's when the silence starts to echo. And suddenly, the avoidant person feels the pain they were trying to avoid all along, the pain of loss, the pain of missing someone who saw them clearly and still chose them by the time they realize what they've done. It's often too late. Because the person who once waited for their maybe has learned to value their own peace over uncertainty. The tragedy is that most avoidants don't mean to hurt anyone. They're just protecting an old wound, a part of them that believes love will always cost them something. But avoiding vulnerability doesn't protect you, it just delays the heartbreak. You either face it now by opening up, or you face it later alone when the person who cared is gone. So if you recognize yourself in this, don't wait until you lose someone to realize they mattered. Say what you need to say before it's too late, because silence might feel safe. But connection only grows when you're brave enough to let someone in. Avoidants often get misunderstood as cold, detached, or emotionally unavailable people who simply don't care. But the truth runs much deeper than that. Most avoidant behavior doesn't come from a lack of love. It comes from a deep-rooted fear that love will hurt. Somewhere along the line, they learned that closeness equals danger. Maybe they grew up in an environment where affection was unpredictable, where love felt conditional, or where being open invited criticism, neglect, or rejection. To survive, they built a protective mechanism, distance. They taught themselves that if they don't get too close, they can't get too hurt. So when someone starts to care about them deeply, their nervous system interprets that connection as a threat. The closer someone gets, the louder the alarm rings inside. The body tenses, the mind starts searching for escape routes. Suddenly, messages that were once loving begin to feel like pressure. A simple I miss you can stir anxiety instead of warmth. And even though the avoidant person might genuinely want the relationship, the fear of being emotionally consumed or rejected pushes them to pull away. It's not a conscious choice to hurt the other person. It's a reflex to protect themselves. They might start creating emotional distance through subtle means, being vague about their feelings, avoiding deeper conversations, or distracting themselves with work or hobbies. They tell themselves it's just space, but really, it's the armor they've worn for years. This armor gives them a sense of safety because it keeps vulnerability out of reach. The problem is it also keeps love out. And while it looks like indifference from the outside, inside, there's often a quiet storm of conflicting emotions. Wanting closeness but fearing it, craving safety but sabotaging it. For the person on the receiving end, this behavior feels deeply confusing. They sense the connection but can't understand why it's being pushed away. They feel the affection one moment and the cold withdrawal the next. What they don't see is that the avoidant is fighting an invisible battle between their desire for love and their fear of it. The withdrawal isn't rejection, it's self-preservation, even if it doesn't look that way. The tragedy is that this pattern often repeats until the avoidant learns to sit with their discomfort instead of running from it. Because avoidance offers temporary relief but long-term pain, the very thing they do to feel safe ends up creating the loneliness they fear most. When they finally recognize that love doesn't have to mean loss or control, they can start to build healthier patterns, ones that allow intimacy to feel less like a threat and more like a choice. But until then, their distance is not proof of apathy. It's proof of how much fear can shape the way a person loves. They're not trying to care less. They're trying to survive the idea of being fully seen. Distance is the comfort zone of the avoidant. It's the place where they feel in control, where no one can touch the parts of them that still ache. When emotions start to deepen and intimacy begins to build, that closeness can feel overwhelming. Their instincts tell them that stepping back will restore safety, that by creating emotional or physical distance, they can calm the unease rising inside. At first it works, the space gives them relief. They can breathe again. They feel grounded as though they've regained their independence and stability. But what feels safe in the beginning slowly transforms into something else. Emptiness. The problem with distance is that it doesn't actually resolve the fear that created it. It simply masks it. By pushing people away, avoidants avoid the triggers that come with connection, but they also avoid the chance to experience real intimacy. That relief they feel when they detach is temporary. The silence that follows starts as comfort but ends in isolation. Over time, that isolation becomes heavy, and they begin to feel the absence of the very thing they longed for: warmth, understanding, and connection. It's ironic because the same space they create to feel safe becomes the very source of their loneliness. In the moment, though, distance feels logical. The avoidant tells themselves they just need time to think, to get their head straight, or that the other person is being too emotional. They rationalize it as needing space for balance. But beneath those reasons lies fear. Fear of dependence, of being seen too clearly, or of being trapped. They believe that pulling back will help them regain control over their emotions, yet what they're really doing is numbing them, and numbness, while comfortable at first, always comes at a cost. The more they withdraw, the less emotionally connected they feel. Not just to others, but to themselves. People on the other side of this dynamic often blame themselves. They think they did something wrong, that if they were calmer or more patient, the avoidant wouldn't have pulled away. But what they don't realize is that the avoidant's retreat has little to do with them and everything to do with how the avoidant learned to cope with fear. The avoidant isn't trying to punish or manipulate. They're trying to manage a level of emotional intensity that feels unbearable. They mistake calm for distance and safety for solitude, not realizing that love requires a certain amount of vulnerability to survive. Eventually, the quiet becomes too loud. The messages stop, the laughter fades, and the space that once felt like freedom starts to feel like loss. The avoidant begins to notice the absence, not just of the person they pushed away, but of the connection they secretly craved. It's then that they understand distance doesn't actually protect the heart. It just delays its breaking. The pain they tried to avoid always finds its way back, only sharper now, because it comes with the realization that safety without closeness isn't safety at all. It's loneliness disguised as control. The moment of silence after someone finally walks away is when reality hits the hardest for an avoidant person. That's when the emotional wall they built begins to crumble piece by piece. They spent so long convincing themselves that distance was protection, that detachment was strength, and that needing someone was weakness. But when the messages stop, when the familiar voice no longer checks in, when the warmth they took for granted fades into cold absence, that's when the pain starts to seep in. It doesn't arrive with anger or chaos. It comes quietly in the form of empty mornings, unshared thoughts, and the haunting realization that someone who used to care deeply has finally stopped trying. Avoidants rarely feel the pain in the middle of the conflict. In those moments, they feel justified, calm, or even relieved. The space feels like peace at first because it silences the noise of emotional intensity they don't know how to handle. But what they don't realize is that peace isn't the same as numbness. The silence they mistake for calm is just the absence of connection. When that silence stretches long enough, it stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like loss. The emptiness reminds them of what they pushed away. Someone who tried, someone who stayed, someone who wanted to understand. It's in those quiet moments that regret begins to settle in. They start replaying the conversations they avoided, the apologies they never gave, the moments they dismissed as unimportant. Every ignored text and cold response starts to feel heavier because they now see it through the lens of what's gone. They realize that the person they thought would always be there finally stopped reaching out. And that's when it hurts. Not because they didn't care all along, but because they finally feel safe enough to care now that the threat of intimacy is gone. The tragedy is that by the time they're ready to feel, it's often too late to repair the damage. Apologies that could have healed things earlier now sound hollow. The other person has already learned to live without them, already decided that peace means not waiting anymore. Avoidants often think they can come back when they're ready, but time changes things. The one who once waited doesn't always stay, and that realization that love doesn't wait forever is what pierces through their defenses. The pain they spent so long avoiding catches up all at once. Overwhelming in its weight and clarity, they begin to understand that love doesn't disappear because they walked away. It transforms. It becomes self-respect for the one who was patient and reflection for the one who withdrew. The avoidant feels the ache of all the things they didn't say, the affection they didn't show, and the vulnerability they withheld. And by the time they're ready to apologize, to reach out, to finally be open, the window has closed. The silence that once comforted them becomes the loudest reminder of what they lost, not because they didn't love, but because they waited too long to show it. Avoidance begins as a defense, not a decision. It's a way to stay safe in a world that once made closeness feel dangerous. The avoidant person builds emotional walls, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Somewhere in their story, love and pain became intertwined, and vulnerability turned into a risk they couldn't afford. So they learn to protect themselves by staying distant. When something feels too intimate, they pull away. When someone shows too much care, they retreat. The logic is simple in their mind. If I don't get too close, I can't get hurt. What they don't see is that every layer of protection they build becomes another layer of isolation. In relationships, this self-protection can look like independence, control, or composure. They pride themselves on not needing anyone, on staying detached, on being the calm one when emotions run high. But underneath that control is fear. Fear of depending on someone, of being seen too deeply, of losing themselves in another person. The walls they build are meant to keep pain out, but love can't enter either. Over time, this guardedness creates an invisible loneliness, one that no amount of logic can fix. They might convince themselves they're fine, that solitude is their choice, but the quiet moments always reveal the truth. The truth is that they crave connection. Just like anyone else, they've just convinced themselves it's not safe to have it. The protection that once gave them comfort starts to feel suffocating. They can't fully open up, can't fully trust, and can't fully experience intimacy. They may attract partners who try to break through their barriers, but the closer someone gets, the stronger their instinct to retreat becomes. And even though they might tell themselves they prefer distance, something inside them aches for the emotional safety they keep pushing away. What started as a survival mechanism slowly becomes a prison of their own making. It's a painful paradox. The avoidant person wants to be loved, but not at the cost of losing control. They want closeness, but fear the vulnerability it demands. So they keep love at arm's length, hoping they can manage both safety and connection. But it doesn't work that way. Love can't thrive in half measures. It needs openness, honesty, and a willingness to be seen. Avoidance starves it of all three. And so the relationship begins to wither. The partner grows tired of guessing, tired of feeling unwanted, and eventually steps back. When that happens, the avoidant person often feels abandoned, not realizing they created the very distance they now grieve. The hardest part is recognizing that protection and isolation are two sides of the same coin. Every time they withdraw to avoid pain, they also deny themselves joy. The shield that once kept them safe becomes the barrier that keeps them lonely. And while it may feel safer to be guarded, that safety comes at the price of connection, the one thing they were longing for all along. Healing from avoidance begins with courage, not the kind that roars loudly, but the quiet kind that chooses to stay when every instinct says to run. Avoidant people are not heartless, they're fearful. They've spent years building a story that vulnerability equals weakness, that relying on others leads to disappointment, and that emotional independence is the only real safety. To them, opening up feels like stepping into a fire without knowing if they'll be burned again. But healing doesn't happen by waiting for fear to disappear. It happens by facing it, slowly, gently, but deliberately, and realizing that vulnerability isn't the enemy. It's the bridge back to connection. Avoidants are often masters at control. They manage their emotions carefully, speak only when they've analyzed every angle, and reveal just enough to keep others close, but not too close. Control gives them the illusion of safety. If they can predict every outcome, maybe they won't get hurt. But love doesn't operate on certainty, it lives in unpredictability. To truly connect, you have to surrender some of that control. You have to let people see you. Not the polished version, but the messy, scared, imperfect one. That's terrifying for someone who equates exposure with danger. Yet it's also the only way to experience real closeness. Healing requires learning to tolerate discomfort. The racing heart during an emotional conversation, the lump in the throat when saying I need you, the vulnerability of admitting fault. These moments don't mean something is wrong, they mean something real is happening. For someone with avoidant tendencies, these experiences are opportunities to practice staying instead of fleeing. Every time they resist the urge to shut down, they teach their nervous system that intimacy doesn't always lead to pain. They start to see that being open doesn't erase their strength, it deepens it. The process isn't about changing overnight. It's about small acts of bravery repeated again and again, responding to a message instead of ignoring it, saying how they feel without minimizing it, apologizing before it's too late. These simple moments slowly dismantle the walls they built. Over time, they realize that control never protected them the way they thought it would. It only kept them from being known, from being loved in a way that felt true. Healing also means taking responsibility. Avoidants often carry pain from the past, but they must learn that old wounds don't justify new damage. It takes courage to admit when fear has dictated their choices, when distance has hurt people they care about. But in that honesty lies power, the power to choose differently. They can begin to love not from fear, but from presence. They can start showing up even when it's uncomfortable and understand that intimacy isn't a trap. It's a mirror that reflects both their strength and their softness. When they embrace that balance, control no longer defines them. Courage does. When it all comes down to it, avoidance is never really about not caring. It's about being afraid to care too much. The avoidant person isn't running from love itself. They're running from the pain they once learned to associate with it. But the truth is, no amount of distance can protect you from feeling. You can hide behind walls. You can convince yourself you're fine. You can pretend silence is peace. But eventually the heart catches up, because love doesn't just disappear when you ignore it. It lingers in the quiet moments, in the what-ifs, in the words you never said. The real strength lies not in running, but in staying, in choosing to be present even when it's uncomfortable. In admitting, I was scared, instead of pretending you never cared. Healing isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming honest. And the moment you stop trying to control love and start allowing yourself to feel it, fully, imperfectly, vulnerably, that's when connection stops being a threat and starts being a gift. So if you recognize yourself in this story, remember this: it's never too late to learn a new way to love. You don't have to keep repeating old patterns. You don't have to wait until it's too late to apologize. You can begin now by choosing courage over control, openness over avoidance, and truth over silence. Because love isn't about who can protect themselves best. It's about who's brave enough to show up with their heart still open. Thank you for listening. And more importantly, for feeling. If this message spoke to something in you, let it remind you that healing isn't about never being afraid again. It's about deciding that connection is worth the risk. So go out there, speak your truth before it turns into regret, and let love find you. Not when it's safe, but when it's real. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your heart. Take care of it. And take care of the hearts that choose to love you too.